Our next speaker is Amanda Holmes, who joins us for the first time at this conference. Amanda is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Applied Arts, Vienna. Her academic work primarily explores Lacanian psychoanalysis, focusing on its ontological implications. She is currently completing her first book manuscript, which is under contract with the State University of New York Press. Her published work includes articles such as Taken on Lease in Psychoanalysis and History, Lacan's Critique of Jaspers, Understanding and the Problem of Meaning in Psychoanalysis, in Lamela, It Thinks, as well as contributions on Alenka Zupancic's What is Sex and on Shame in Queer Politics. Her paper today is titled The Think About Symbolism, Contextualizing Lacan's Theory of the Phallus. Amanda, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Arsalan, for the introduction. Many thanks to Lorenzo and Tadej for the invitation. In his writing, In Memory of Ernest Jones, on his theory of symbolism, Lacan does not so much provide an argument for the primacy of the phallic signifier in the Freudian project. Instead, he shows the perils of thinking that the phallus is anything else, laying out the phallus's function as a privileged signifier insofar as it is a signifier of lack. The phallus serves the function of signifying the lack of being that is wrought in the subject by his relation to the signifier, writes Lacan. This gives its full import to the fact that all the symbols Jones's study highlights are phallic symbols. The essential distinction between a phallic symbol and the phallic signifier renders this text particularly useful for crystallizing the stakes of Lacan's thinking in this period regarding the phallus. The text on Ernest Jones was written in the period of the 6th year of the seminar in 1959, but it culminates a number of threads that run throughout Seminar 5 regarding castration, the 3 moments of the Oedipus complex, and the signification of the phallus. It thus serves as a kind of counterpart to Lacan's better-known writing from 1958, The Signification of the Phallus. In what follows, I will contextualize several key points in Lacan's theory of the phallic signifier, drawing from this constellation of texts and Seminar 5, tracing out in particular how Lacan's thinking of the phallic signifier is part of a larger conversation and argument with his contemporaries, in particular Jones. I will attempt to show how the limits of the phallic signifier lay the ground for what Lacan will formulate several years later in terms of the objet petit a. These limits of the phallic signifier have primarily to do with the problematic notions of origin and cause that it implies, and they are in fact highlighted in Lacan's own criticism of Jones. The task then is not only to explicate the phallic signifier in Lacan's thinking in this period, but to show that Lacan, in his formulation of the signifier of lack, is already coming up against the problem for which he does not yet have a name, but which he nevertheless formulates in terms of the cause of desire. This is no small task, so let us begin. We will do so with a letter. In a letter to Donald Winnicott, written in August of 1960, Lacan expresses his consternation at Winnicott's response to Lacan's text published the previous year in Memory of Ernest Jones. Winnicott had apparently been baffled, claiming neither to have been able to assimilate the meaning of Lacan's text, nor to gauge its bearing. Betraying a mixture of vanity, irritation, and perseverance, Lacan insists that Winnicott would have had no trouble seeing the relevance of his text if only Lacan's teachings were more widely dispersed throughout the psychoanalytic community. Lacan issues a thinly veiled complaint about the lack of appropriate respect for his teachings within the International Psychoanalytic Association, and explains any difficulty in reading his work accordingly. Lacan's explanation has the structure of a humorous tautology. One can hear an echo of Alfred Jarry's joke, which Lacan was fond of repeating. From the mouth of Father Ubu, "Gentlemen, long live Poland, because if there were no Poland, there would be no Poles." According to Lacan, Winnicott would have had no problem understanding his article if only he had already understood his teaching. Lacan essentially tells Winnicott that if he cannot assimilate the meaning of his text, it's simply because, in his teachings, or his teachings have not been assimilated into psychoanalysis. Father Ubu's joke, then, might be modified. Long live Lacanianism, because without Lacanianism there would be no Lacanians. Or, taking it a step further, long live Lacanians, because without Lacanians no one would be able to read Lacan. Lacan returns to Father Ubu's joke several times throughout his seminar, and it is a prominent feature in Kant of Exode. Each time it is evoked, the joke serves a different function. It proves to be a kind of theoretical multi-tool, with sundry useful gadgets. In Kant of Exode, for example, the joke shows the limits of analytic judgment. Here, Lacan makes Kant the butt of the Polish joke. As Joan Kopczak has brilliantly read it, in this text, the Polish joke relies on the fact that it is, in fact, false. The historical reality of Poland has shown that Poles will continue to exist, even if Poland does not. That in spite of the seemingly logical dependence of Poles on Poland, history shows us otherwise. Kopczak writes, propping up his thesis about the universalizability of moral law on the law of non-contradiction, Kant pays short shrift to those sorts of synthetic historical judgments that would, for example, permit him to refute Ubu's unworldly illogic. The Polish joke, in short, shows how Kant's analytic judgment is not up to the task of founding the great moral maxim. The joke comes up again in the 9th year of Lacan's seminar. This time he invokes it to illustrate the relations between signifier and demand. The signifier is said to incarnate itself in the repetition of demand. Each time a demand is repeated, it underscores the existence of the signifier as such. Referring to the Father Ubu joke, Lacan develops the notion of the Polish signifier and says, the demand is the Poland of the signifier. In other words, long live demand, for without demand there would be no signifier. Several years earlier, in the 5th year of his seminar, Lacan emphasizes that the Polish joke marks the metonymic dimension, and it is here that we can see how the structure of this joke in particular makes it endlessly useful as an illustration of Lacan's teaching. The contiguity of the signifying chain, the movement from Poland to Poles, or in our version, from Lacanianism to Lacanians to readers of Lacan, demonstrates a relationship of derivation at the conceptual level, but what makes the joke work is the metonymic sliding from one signifier to the other, which has a metaphoric effect. All of a sudden, rather than seeing Lacanianism as the sheer culmination of the existence of numerous Lacanians, the direction of causality is reversed. There are only Lacanians, or those who read Lacan, because of the existence of Lacanianism. As Lacan puts it, it's here in the metonymic other that this lightning flash occurs, casting a light that's not only comical, but also rather farcical. Lacan's explanation to Winnicott, then, you would have had no problem understanding me if only you already did, or put otherwise, long live Lacanianism, for without Lacanians no one could read Lacan, exposes something that is simultaneously ridiculous, a farce, but also actually true. Any novice, it is the case that Winnicott, had he been more familiar with Lacan's teaching, would have been able to read the text on Jones. Any novice reader of Lacan will attest to the fact that it's only after reading at least several of Lacan's écrits, and perhaps some commentary on the side, that any one of Lacan's writings begins to make sense on its own account. Lacan shows in both content and form that it is in the chain of the signifier that meaning insists, but that none of the chain's elements consists in the signification it can provide at that very moment. In other words, one learns the structuralist lesson that signification depends upon a network of signifiers rather than on any one-to-one correlation of signifier and signified by reading Lacan, not only because he says so, but also because Lacan pushes this point to its limit through his style. To return to Lacan's letter to Winnicott, he goes on to say that Winnicott's bafflement is particularly hard for him to bear because he feels he has so much in common with him, and he so often finds himself in agreement with Winnicott's thinking. Or rather, he finds that Winnicott's thought so often accords with his own. Lacan asks, does not the transitional object, the concept for which Winnicott was well known, all of whose merits I have shown to those close to me, indicate the site at which, precociously, that distinction of desire in relation to need is marked? Here, Lacan aligns perhaps one of the most central pillars of his teaching, at least in the period in the late 1950s and early 1960s, with Winnicott's transitional object. Indeed, one can trace references to Winnicott throughout Lacan's work, and in particular in the fourth seminar, where he likens it to the very concept of object lack that he reiterates as his own response to the theory of the object relation. Not only does Lacan then say that Winnicott would have been able to understand his article if his teaching had been more available, he goes on to even more aggressively contend that Winnicott's thinking, without Winnicott even realizing it, confirms and reinforces his own teaching. This is, moreover, the same strategy that Lacan takes in explaining his text on Ernest Jones. While he is no doubt critical of Jones, and infinitely more so than he is of Winnicott, I'd say. They have a contentious history, as we know, dating back to Lacan's first presentation at the IPA in Marienbad. And Lacan repeatedly accuses Jones of completely misreading Freud. Even so, he finds throughout his work important markers of his own theoretical insights. Lacan chose to focus on Jones's theory of symbolism for his memorial text, in part because, as he writes to Winnicott, I find in it a confirmation of my theses concerning the privileged function of the phallus. The way in which I derive it from its relations with the signifier is illustrated in a manner that is all the more striking, in that it is without the author's awareness, by virtue of the fact that none of the examples that he is led to posit in order to satisfy his theory is anything other than a phallic symbol. Jones's text on symbolism, moreover, is framed by a consideration of metaphor, a consideration, as we know, that is also important to Lacan. Let us now turn to Jones's text and to Lacan's commentary on it, and see if we can glean more from it than did Winnicott. If not because we are already Lacanians, then at least because for us, Lacanianism exists. In Jones's theory of symbolism, he distinguishes what he calls true symbolism from symbolism in the widest sense. The former is the specific domain of psychoanalysis and is characterized by its relation to the unconscious. True symbolism, he writes, arises as the result of intrapsychical conflict between the repressing tendencies and the repressed, and only what is repressed is symbolized. In true symbolism, according to Jones, the process is completely unconscious, and the affect invested in the symbolized idea has not proved capable of sublimation. True symbolism is opposed to symbolism in the widest sense, which is a notion expanded to the point of near oblivion. Jones writes, if the word symbolism is to be taken in its widest sense, the subject is seen to comprise almost the whole development of civilization. For what is this other than a never-ending series of evolutionary substitutions, a ceaseless replacement of one idea, interest, capacity, or tendency by another? Jones's project in this essay, then, is to try to demarcate true symbolism as that particular sense to which psychoanalysis is particularly and singularly attuned, from this more general sense of symbolism, which is so broad, including as it does fields of thought as diverse as magic, religion, art, mysticism, and metaphysics. Moreover, Jones is concerned with guarding against the kind of Jungian archetypal symbolism that was at the heart of the controversy between Freud and Jung in 1912. In order to distinguish psychoanalytic symbolism or true symbolism from this danger of archetypes, Jones specifies that true symbolism abides by 6 characteristics, which he borrows actually from the work of Sachs and Rank. We don't have time to go into detail on all of these, but most important for our purposes are those of what he calls linguistic connections and the non-dependence on individual conditioning factors. Metaphor is, as Jones sees it, a part of symbolism in the wider sense, but it is the most important to psychoanalysis as it underscores precisely these 2 features of symbolism, linguistic connections and the non-dependence on individual conditioning factors. Metaphor, according to Jones, is the purely linguistic process of generalized symbolism, understood as the human capacity for substitution. We can already read here one important point of disagreement that reveals a complicated convergence between Lacan and Jones. For Lacan, who has, as you know, identified metaphor along with metonymy as one of the 2 structures that constitute the field of the signifier, The very notion of the unconscious, which is structured like a language, is inseparable from the structure of metaphor. For Jones, on the other hand, metaphor is simply the way that linguists and philologists contend with the human capacity for symbolism. The field of the unconscious is carved out elsewhere. Nevertheless, it is at play in the characteristics of true symbolism. To put it quite simply, where Lacan insists that metaphoric substitution names one of the two axes of signification, and thus the field of psychoanalytic inquiry as such, Jones tries to contain psychoanalysis's domain to neatly demarcate it as something separate from this generalized symbolism as articulated in the terms of linguistics. The difficulty lies in maintaining this distinction throughout his argument. Metaphor is, on the one hand, set aside as a particular linguistic treatment of symbolism, but it also proves to be inscribed in the very terms of true symbolism. What Jones says about metaphor is instructive for our purposes because he shows us the pitfalls of psychoanalysis bereft of the theory of the phallic signifier as signifier of lack. That is, Jones demonstrates the necessity of the Lacanian insight that the structure of signification depends upon the phallic signifier by coming close to it in his treatment of metaphor, but evading it as soon as he comes up against it. Let us turn now briefly to Jones's account of metaphor before concluding with a few comments about what all this has to do with the Lacanian phallic signifier and the lesson that I think Lacan learns from Jones. Jones rehearses a philological account of metaphor in 3 stages of its so-called decay, marking the distinction of a ratio of figurative and literal meaning. In the first of these stages, a word that is most often used in its literal sense is occasionally used in a figurative one, where its metaphorical nature is at once obvious. An example would be the wrath of the gale. This is the example that Jones uses. The wrath of the gale is the first stage. In the second stage, both literal and figurative senses are familiar, so that when the word is used in the latter sense, we are conscious of its metaphorical nature, but only slightly or on reflection, pre-consciously, as psychoanalysts would say. Thus, we speak of the depth of the sea literally and the depth of despair figuratively. In the third stage, the figurative sense has become the usual literal one, and through either ignorance or forgetfulness, we no longer are aware of its original meaning. Thus, the word melancholy does not make us think of black bile, nor does the expression acuity of mind make us think of a cutting edge. Here, the decay of the metaphor is complete, and the figurative symbol has acquired an objective reality of its own in the place of the subjective one of the earlier stages. In this account, we have 3 versions of possible combinations between a supposed literal and figurative set of meanings. The first is primarily literal, where the figurative use is a kind of aberration. Here we can say that the creative dimension of metaphor that Lacan speaks of in his own account is most apparent. To describe the wrath of the gale gives an example of a metaphor whose strength is predicated on its uniqueness and its irregularity. The fact that it is not a common occurrence renders the metaphor of wrath in relation to gale fully intact, not yet decayed. The second possibility is of equal parts literal and figurative. Depth can be assigned to a body of water as easily as to a condition of the soul. The particular confusions of the depth metaphor are, of course, well known to psychoanalysis. Here, the metaphor's power is beginning to decay because its creative aspect is diminished. The depth metaphor is beginning to be played out, all too familiar. The third possibility is when the figurative meaning has become entirely eclipsed and made literal. The distinction between the figurative and the literal no longer applies, as the figurative is simply taken to be a part of the literal definition. Interestingly, one of the examples that Jones uses for this third stage of the fully decayed metaphor is melancholia. Evoking, as it does, the very advent of psychoanalysis, wherein it is no longer the physical and physiological element of black bile that the term refers, but instead to a condition of the soul, to a state of profoundly painful dejection, to an identification with the lost object. The use of metaphor tends towards its own destruction. What unfolds here is an account of the evolution of language as a gradual process of figurative meanings becoming literal, of words taking on new connotations as one significance becomes dominant. While Jones attempts to sequester metaphor into the domain of linguistics, it creeps back in as a kind of prop to his own theory of symbolism. Both metaphor and symbolism are shown to rely on a regression to an original primitive relation. Simile, he says, is a kind of primary process for metaphor. A metaphor presupposes a simile, which is the more primitive figure. On this account, any symbol is always propped up by a once original idea. Just as any metaphor can be traced back to an original relation of simile, any symbol can always be traced back to an original identification. We can begin to see the difficulty Jones finds himself in, for he has to posit at bottom, logically speaking, or at the origin, historically, mythologically, some essential and necessary connection. Indeed, Jones goes on to suggest that there are really only a few basic, original, irreducible ideas that account for true symbolism. All symbols represent ideas of the self and the immediate blood relatives, he writes, or of the phenomena of birth, love, or death. In other words, they represent the most primitive ideas and interests imaginable. Jones ends up reifying the symbol in a set number of primary ideas, such that even though there may be thousands of symbols that come up in a particular analysis, and anything can become one, in the end, there are only a limited number of ideas that they can signify. True symbolism, the privileged territory of psychoanalysis, leads us back, in the end, to a relatively fixed set of ideas: birth, love, sex, and death. In order to illustrate the 6 characteristics of true symbolism, Jones chooses the Punchinello of the marionette theater as a phallic symbol. Punchinello is representative of a certain class of symbols that equate the phallus with the male member with the little man. Punchinello is characterized by a comicality, or a kind of comicalness, and an ugliness. Etymologically, Jones points out, Punchinello derives from the Neapolitan Polichinella, which is a diminutive of Policena, which refers, I guess, to a young turkey cock. Its Latin root, he says, pullus, means the young of any animal. The Punchinello is not only himself a phallic symbol, but his hooked nose, the short staff or bat that he wields redouble the phallic signifiers. Jones's analysis of the Punchinello leads us back again and again to the phallus in its comical, ugly, or violent depictions. This is at the heart of Lacan's criticism of Jones. Since he continues to refer symbols to ideas, understanding by ideas the concrete props that develop is supposed to give symbols. I think I skipped a sentence here. So this is at the heart of Lacan's criticism of Jones. Since he continues to refer symbols to ideas, understanding by ideas the concrete props that development is supposed to give symbols, he himself cannot help but maintain the notion of a negative conditioning of symbolism, right to the bitter end, which stops him from grasping its structural function. Lacan asks, would it not be simpler to accept here the obvious material fact that there is no other mainspring of metaphorical effect than the substitution of one signifier for another as such, and that we see this even in the Punchinello that Jones himself evokes? How can one fail to see the dominance of the signifier here manifest in its most materially phonemic form? For beyond the falsetto and the morphological anomalies of this personage, who descends directly from the satyr and the devil, it is clearly homophonies which, condensing in double exposures, like witticisms and slips, most surely gives us away. It is a phallus that he symbolizes. In the background of Lacan's reading of Jones's text on symbolism is the running commentary that can be found in Seminar 5 on 2 other texts by Jones, The Phallic Phase and the Early Development of Female Sexuality. At the crux of Lacan's engagement with Jones in each of these instances stands the question of what it means to privilege the phallus, whether as symbol, as object, as a phase, or as a signifier. I quote from Seminar 5. Mr. Jones, whose usefulness to and function in analysis are in direct proportion to what he didn't understand, very quickly tried to expound the castration complex by finding an equivalent for it. To be frank, the phallic signifier was the object of what one could perhaps call a veritable phobia throughout his entire existence as a writer and analyst. The best of his writing, which culminates in his article on the phallic phase, consists precisely in saying this: why privilege this damned phallus that we have here right under our feet at every moment, this inconsistent object, moreover, whereas other things are just as interesting, the vagina, for example. And effectively, the man is right. It's quite clear that this object is no less interesting than the phallus. We know this. It's just that what astonishes him and what he doesn't understand is that they don't have the same function. Throughout his work, Jones tries to deal with sexual difference either by offering up a kind of parity or equality, or by developing a more general alternative. Whether by finding a physiological equivalent to the penis in the female body, or abstracting into something that can encompass both sexes. He's looking always for that originary idea. Jones turns to the notion of aphanasis, for example, because it is, as he puts it, wider and more complete than castration. He defines aphanasis as the disappearance of sexual pleasure and offers it up as a kind of equal opportunity employer of castration. Jones writes, "The male dread of being castrated may or may not have a precise female counterpart, but what is more important is to realize that this dread is only a special case, and that both sexes ultimately dread exactly the same thing, aphanasis." Lacan finds Jones to be an important foil for his own thinking on this point. Indeed, Jones's notion of aphanasis becomes useful to Lacan later on, around Seminar 10 in his thinking on anxiety, where Lacan comes to sort of translate it as the disappearance of desire. But even in the formulation of aphanasis, Jones avoids the problem of the phallus and castration. He employs his own theory of symbolism, whereby the phallus finds its concrete support in the penis, in the body. This infinite recourse to some primordial idea is reflected again when Jones ends his article on the phallic phase with the biblical reference, with a piece of wisdom whose source is more ancient than Plato. In the beginning, male and female created he, them. For Lacan, the phallus comes into being supported not by a primordial idea, but by a relation to desire. The phallus enters into play immediately when the subject addresses the mother's desire. This phallus is veiled and will remain veiled until the end of time, for one simple reason, which is that it's an ultimate signifier in the signifier's relationship with the signified. The phallic signifier functions as a veil, for the phallus is a signifier whose function in the intersubjective economy of analysis may lift the veil from the function it served in the mysteries. For it is the signifier that is destined to designate meaning effects as a whole, insofar as the signifier conditions its presence as a signifier. The phallic signifier is the signifier of nothing other than a lack. It is for this reason that Lacan can suture the signifier of signification to that of desire. Both are predicated on the signification of lack, which is not hypostatized into lack as a thing, but which provides the empty stage on which desire and signification can be played. The Lacanian phallic signifier insists that we avoid all mythological or metaphysical interpretation of symbols and begin by studying them as empty signifiers. The question is, how is it that we can think the lack that the phallic signifier entails? How to think it without hypostatizing it as an idea dealing with lack, with absence, with nothing? Lacan ultimately moves beyond the theory of the phallic signifier. Beginning with Seminar 7, he no longer refers to it, and a series of other concepts take its place. There are limits to what the phallic signifier gives us, and I think he learns some of these limits by repeating some of the moves that Jones makes. I think that I'm just summarizing here for the sake of time. So I suggest that Lacan moves beyond the phallic signifier and looks elsewhere to formulate this paradoxical representation of nothing, As we know, he moves in Seminar 7 to das Ding, and then to the Agalma in Seminar 8, and eventually to the objet petit a. What we can trace in the trajectory of thought among these concepts is a movement from the question of origins to that of cause with regard to the notion of lack. To conclude rather abruptly, perhaps we can formulate what I've tried to show in this paper in yet another version of the Polish joke: long live the phallus, for without the phallus, there would be no objet petit a. Okay.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Okay, the floor is open for questions and comments, discussion. Please.
Thanks so much for this wonderful talk. The structure of this Polish Lacanian joke that you mentioned recalls for me the sentence by Friedrich Jameson that is, dialectical thinking is nothing more than the repeating of dialectical sentences or something along these lines. And Jameson is obviously very concerned with the construction of style and the sort of positing or accounting for a particular kind of style that is in relation to dialectical thinking. So my question for you is, do you see what you're trying to do or account for in this kind of contextualizing of the phallus as being an account of Lacanian style in some sense?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's, in a way, it's really not at all a Lacanian style. I have I can't sort of shake off my sort of like analytic philosophy sort of history in some way. That I'm always looking for definitions, but there is something, at least at the level of trying to chart out the way that certain terms are developing within the sort of history of Lacan's thinking that maybe would be at least evocative of what that point is that I'm trying to name, which is just that it's really difficult to talk about Lacan because oftentimes the signifiers themselves, depending on how they're situated within the seminar, have slightly different nuances that can often make quite a big difference. And so in that sense, yes, but not really, that's not so much a style as it is a project. So that's more methodology, I would say. So the method would maybe be in that direction, whereas my style, unfortunately, I can't really imitate it. It's not my style, yeah.
Please hold them.
Thank you so much for that very, very careful, meticulous presentation. I very much enjoyed it. I actually don't have so much a question, more as a request that I hope you appreciate. But you mentioned that you were summarizing for the sake of time at the end, and I would really like to know if you could elaborate a bit more about like what you wanted to say about the limits of the phallus from Seminar 5 and the trajectory you briefly charted.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, essentially, I'm trying this out. I mean, in a way, it was convenient that I ran out of time. So let me try it here and say what I think might be at play. I think that there is a potential repetition, a kind of danger in that Lacan himself sees. If you just look at the very last lines of the essay on the signification of the phallus, he concludes this way: the function of the phallic signifier touches on the most profound relation, that by which the ancients embodied therein, the nous and the logos. And I think there's kind of an interesting repetition of what Jones concludes his essay on the phallic stage with, right? In the beginning created he, them. But it's at the level of identifying two signifiers in Greek. And I think that there's the limits of the phallic signifier really just have to do with the domain of like articulating within the symbolic order how this notion of lack functions. So it's not so much at the level of like actually repeating Jones's error, but I think that Lacan sees where there's a kind of proximity where he really has to move beyond this symbolic this emphasis on a theory of the symbolic in order to get at the problem of lack that's so central to his thinking. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we have time for one more question, I think, if there is. Otherwise, we can. Okay. Sorry, there is one more question.
I mean, I think it's related to the other question too. It's just, I guess I'm curious what I mean, where I saw the direction of the paper going would be that to some extent, what Lacan then encounters is the notion that in other words, the structural lack itself, the moment of repetition is that it itself becomes a kind of origin.
Yeah.
That he then sees that, of course, he is not repeating in a literal way what Jones does, but repeats the problem of positing an origin, even though the problem of lack was to try to overcome that.
Yeah, exactly.
So that then this problem is then what begins to emerge, with the sort of shifting away, let's say, from, the emphasis on the phallic signifier to something that is not without a phallic signifier, but nonetheless can't be reducible to it.
Yeah.
So that there's in some sense, he's sort of complicating how he wants to think lack as well, or what is, I mean.
Yeah, yeah. I can only agree with that.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that brings us to a close. Thank you again, Amanda, and thank you, Alden, for these elegant presentations. And please join me to